Украина, по сути, никогда не имела устойчивой традиции своей подлинной государственности.
Крым и Севастополь возвращаются в родную гавань.
Say what, Putin? Ukraine is not a country, and you have the right to take away Crimea from that non-existent country?
Let's have a look at how Putin could or could not square that circle.
I'm Indy Nidell.
I'm Spartacus Olson.
And this is Into Context, a Time Ghost documentary format where we provide historical context to the headlines of today.
In this set of episodes, the war in Ukraine.
In 2014, Russia violently annexes Crimea by sending in proxy troops and staging a rigged referendum to join the Russian Federation, an annexation that the world rejects to this day in 2022.
Russian dictator Vladimir Putin's claim that Crimea is not part of Ukraine has now been extended with claims that all of Ukraine is a made-up country to justify an illegal aggression on Ukraine that threatens world peace. A made-up country, Indy. You feel pretty strongly about that sentence, so shoot.
Yeah. Claiming that Ukraine is a made-up country is a pointless claim because, newsflash, every country is a made-up country. Yep, every single country on Earth was at some point not a country, and then it was made up. Perhaps it was torn from an empire. Perhaps it was newly conquered territory. Whatever it was, all countries are made-up countries. This argument of Putin's is exactly the same argument Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin made concerning Poland. Since the modern Poland was created by the Treaty of Versailles, it wasn't a real country and had no right to exist. The Nazi government, even before invading in 1939, never recognized the German-Polish border. But what about Germany? The German Empire was only created in 1871 from a unification of a variety of states like Hanover, Prussia, Bavaria, Saxony, and so forth, who had different traditions and different cultures. Heck, some were Catholic and some were Protestant. And if you think that's not a big deal, then perhaps you should visit Ireland. There was no unified German mentality, to the point that in the First World War, Bavarian troops were used on the Western Front and not the Eastern one because they refused to fight to defend Prussian territory. And when Hitler launched his Beer Hall Putsch in 1923, which is also called the Hitler-Ludendorff Putsch, one of the reasons it failed was because Hitler's Bavarian base would not follow the Prussian Erich Ludendorff. Think that through. Even ultra-nationalistic go Germany Adolf Hitler could not convince his base to follow a Prussian. I grew up in the United States, which is the most made-up country of them all. Part of it rebelled against the British, and that part included Dutch settlements. Florida was ceded by the Spanish to resolve a different border dispute. A huge chunk of it came from Napoleon, who needed money for war. Texas was welcomed in once it had gained independence from Mexico. Other parts were taken from Mexico, other parts from indigenous peoples, and heck, Alaska was bought from the Russians. Think that through. Alaska is 1.71 million square kilometers. Ukraine is 603,548. Alaska is 3 times the size of Ukraine and is former Russian territory and is definitely part of a made-up country considering it's 2,500 kilometers away by land from Washington State and the rest of the US. That's further than London to Athens. So is it okay if Putin marches into Alaska, since that was once Imperial Russian territory and has no real historic connection with the contiguous US? Of course not. The made-up country argument to justify aggression against a sovereign nation is bullshit. It always has been, and it likely always will be.
Okay, the first nation states, countries based on some kind of ethnic or cultural sameness with clearly defined geographic borders, arise in the 1830s, and almost all countries, while they have roots in predecessor countries, are created after that date. Most actually after 1918. At the 1919 Peace Conference in Paris, the nations of the world defined the principles of self-determination for all peoples. These are further cemented in the United Nations Charter in 1945. Now, The principles guarantee sovereignty to nations and the orderly creation of countries based on the will of the people. They do not give a group of people or a region the automatic right to just leave a country and make their own or join another country at will. They also forbid other countries to decide for a country what they should do, how they should be governed, and what alliances they should enter into.
Okay, but let's get back to Crimea 2014. I said in the beginning that it was a rigged referendum. Here's how. It's orchestrated by Russia as a choice between full independence in a new Crimean state or joining the Russian Federation. Those two. That's not a difficult choice. Full independence would mean an unsustainable economy and a failed state. So they vote to join Russia.
To this day, Crimeans stand by that choice. However, surveys have shown that between 53 and 77% of Crimeans say that they would have chosen to stay in Ukraine had that choice been available. By sheer statistics, that means that a large part, even the majority of Russian-speaking Crimeans, would also have wanted to stay in Ukraine. On top of that, this vote is made while strangely anonymous armed men, not Ukrainians, roam the streets and occupy official buildings.
Okay, but let's ignore for a moment the evident reality of what I said in the beginning. Is there an historical tradition to say that Crimea is first and foremost Russian?
Well, historically, that is, before the Soviet Union, Crimea was home to a multi-ethnic population who spoke Russian, Greek, Ukrainian, and Tatar. The Tatars were the biggest group, with 34%. They were considered by the Soviets to be a bedrock of dangerous counter-revolutionary movements, and persecuted. By 1939, their share of the population has been reduced to 20%, or 200,000. Most of them are then deported during and after World War II. In 1944 alone, 184,000 are forcefully resettled to the Uzbek SSR. In the 1959 census, no Crimean Tatars are found to be living in Crimea.
They are replaced with Russian and Ukrainian settlers. By 1959, 71% of Crimea identifies as Russian and 22% as Ukrainian. Significantly, they depended on Ukraine economically, and the region is made part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in 1954. Ukraine is at that time one of the independent Soviet Socialist Republics of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics as formed in 1922, with a constitution and international recognition from 1924 on, and partly expanded in 1945 after World War II, and has the legal right Spartacus mentioned earlier. The legal right to secede from the USSR, cemented in the Soviet and the Republic's constitutions.
Well, yes, on paper. In practice, they are de facto client republics to the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, the Russian SFSR, ruled from Moscow. But by the 1980s, the Soviet Union is thawing towards more freedom, democracy, and true independence for the republics under Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms perestroika. Then, in August, in 1991, hardline communists stage a coup in Moscow to reverse the reforms. To isolate Ukraine from this turmoil, on August 24, 1991, the Supreme Council of Ukraine, in accordance with Soviet Union law, triggers Article 69 of the Constitution of the Ukrainian SSR and secede.
In New York, at UN headquarters, the Ukrainian ambassador to the UN informs the other member states that the Ukrainian SSR is now called just Ukraine. Yep, you heard that right. Ukraine is already a member of the UN, and has been since the UN founding in 1945 as the only Soviet republic independently represented at the UN.
In any case, the coup in Moscow fails after only 2 days of popular protests led by Russian SFSR President Boris Yeltsin. Gorbachev returns to office, but the Soviet Union is now collapsing.
It dissolves itself, on December 31st, 1991. Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine become sovereign independent nations. Ukraine is formed with the borders that she had in 1945, with the addition of Crimea from 1954.
4 weeks before the Soviet Union dissolves, on December 2nd, 1991, the first 3 countries recognize Ukraine as she then stands. Among them is Russia. The Federal Soviet Union recognizes her the week before it ceases to exist. By June 1992, she has been recognized by 132 countries, and her existence becomes a matter of international treaties and law.
So yes, Ukraine is a real country. Crimea and the regions in Donbass are part of that country. This is not a matter for debate. It is the law. To disregard her legal status, to claim that she does not exist, is a threat to the peaceful coexistence of all nations. It is a denial of the very principles that have guided the world out of 2 world wars towards a peace between the major powers that lasted from 1945 to 2022. If that principle is not upheld, if the laws governing the existence of nations are not respected, then every nation is at threat from violent aggression by neighbors with greater military might. Russia's aggression against Ukraine, Putin's denial of her existence, is a threat to the whole world.
We will continue putting out these videos, putting the conflict in Ukraine into context. To join that effort, join the Time Ghost Army at patreon.com or timeghost.tv. Never forget.